see how our day goes. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us. I'm Amber Mathewson. I'm the director for Pima County Public Library. And on behalf of all of us at the library, we're delighted to welcome you today for our author talk with Robin Talley. This event was coordinated by our LGBTQ plus services committee. We're so proud of this group, which has over 20 years of service and commitment to diversity and inclusion in our community. And we'd like to thank the Friends of the Pima County Public Library for funding this event and so many more programs here at the library. Our friends are steadfast supporters of the library. They help helping to engage, educate, and enrich our community in immeasurable ways. We thank them for their ongoing generosity. There are many ways that you can get involved with Friends of the Library. You can attend library events, donate books for their sales, and purchase books online by visiting pimafriends.com. That's pimafriends.com. And we'd like to thank you, our fabulous community, for joining us. You're the reason we're here. I'd like to hand this over now to Caitlin Sparks, who's the chair of our library's LGBTQ plus services committee. Caitlin.
Hi, thank you so much, Amber. We're just so grateful for your support, the support of our library administration. Our committee is over 20 years old, and we really wouldn't be here without having an administration that is so dedicated to providing all of these inclusive and diverse services. We even have our library logo that has been put in rainbow to support our LGBTQ plus community. If you would like a t-shirt like mine, we do have them on Cafe Press. We'll put a link in the chat for you. And we would just like to echo our appreciation of the Friends of the Library group. Without all their work and funding, we couldn't do events like these. Again, I'm Caitlin Sparks. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I've been the chair of the Pima County Public Library now, LGBTQ plus services committee for the last several years. And in our non-pandemic times, our committee can be found at outreach events throughout Pima County. We go to Pride on Parade, Pride in the Park, and we're also at safe spaces like Eon Youth Lounge with the young adults. We present Rainbow Story Times, and we've been to almost every library now. Our Rainbow Story Times are inclusive story times that are for LGBTQ plus families and their friends. We share stories, music, crafts, and a lot of joy. And we're just really eagerly looking forward to getting back to our in-person programs. But for now, you can join us virtually on Zoom if you're interested in our monthly adult book club called Rainbow Reads. We'll post a link to that in the chat too if you'd like to find out more. But let's talk about who we're here for. We're here for Robin Talley. Thank you for joining us, Robin.
Thank you.
Robin's pronouns are she, her, and she's a queer author who grew up in the Southwest Virginia. She's now in DC with her wife and their kids. She did digital communications for LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, educational equity, and other progressive causes. And then she went to writing full time, and she's now a New York Times bestselling author of 7 novels for young adults. One of them is Pulp, which I am reading right now. And Amber told me she recently read Music from Another World. Her books focus on LGBTQ plus characters, and they've been selected for honors, including the Junior Library Guild, Amelia Bloomer Project, Kids Indie Next, and ALA Rainbow Reads. So before I go on too much, just some housekeeping. If you have questions for Robin, we're going to do a 20-minute Q&A with the audience using the chat at the end. So don't worry, we'll let you know when that happens so you can type in your questions. So for now, just sit back and enjoy Robin's presentation, and let us welcome Robin. Hi, Robin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. And at first, I get to have the exciting challenge of figuring out if I can share my screen with you all. I have been made the presenter, so that's cool. And now I'm going to try to show Google Chrome. Okay, I'm going to see if I can get this to display. And I'm going to ask if somebody would do me a huge favor of typing into the chat. All right. In just a minute, you should see the first slide that I've got, which is a picture of a stack of my books with my name on it. And I'm hoping you can also hear me okay. Let's see. Okay, If anybody wants to type into the chat and tell me they can see that screen, that will be awesome, and I will go ahead and get started in the meantime. And if it turns out you can't see it, let me know and I will see if I can troubleshoot. All right, thank you so much. I see from several people you can see and hear, so that's awesome. So I'm going to talk a little, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me for this event. I'm so glad that your library does this every year. I think that's awesome. I wish every library system did this. And thank you so much, Caitlin, for that awesome introduction. So I'm going to talk a little about who I am and what I've written and what it's like to be a writer, and particularly a writer of queer young adult books. And then, as Caitlin mentioned, we'll do questions at the end. All right, so who I am, as Caitlin also mentioned, I live in Washington, D.C. with my wife and our 2 kids. Our older daughter is about to turn 5, and our younger daughter is 8 months old. And normally when I give in-person presentations, I like to show a picture of our family together. I'm not going to do that today because we try not to post pictures of the kids online, but I will find some creative ways to indicate the children's presence, I think. Starting with this. This is a drawing our daughter did of our family. So you can see everybody there on the far left in this picture at the bottom. We're pretty sure that that's my wife, Julia, rather than me. And the reason we think it's her is because she's got these circles on the sides of her head that are either the headset that I'm wearing right now, because this is actually her headset that I borrowed. She does a lot more Zoom calls than I do. Or it could be Princess Leia buns, because when Julia was a kid, she was Princess Leia for Halloween one year, and she had the buns and everything. And we've told that story to our daughter a lot of times, and she really enjoys that story. So it's possible that that's my wife as Princess Leia as a child. In the next drawing, we think that's me, and next one over that is probably the older child. And then down there on the end, that is either the baby or it's the cat we used to have. We are not really clear. It could go either way if you look at the shape of the ears and everything that's going on. Then up above us is the sun, of course, and next to the sun on the same level is our house, which looks here like either a bucket of popcorn or maybe an ice cream cone. Either way, it's clearly a nice place that we live. So as Caitlin mentioned, I used to work full-time in online communications for several different nonprofit organizations here in DC until the kids were born, and then I transitioned into writing and parenting full-time. So it's very much a combination these days. So in terms of what I've written, Caitlin mentioned that I've got 7 books that are out on shelves. And they all focus on characters who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or elsewhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. They're all books about teenagers, for teenagers. And so there are 6 that are out on shelves now, and a 7th that is coming out in just a few weeks on December 1st. I'm not going to talk in detail about all 7 books today, but I will talk about a few. And then at the end, when we get to the Q&A portion, I'm happy to take questions about any of the books. So I will start out by talking about the one that is coming out soon. It is called The Love Curse of Melody McIntyre, and it's a romantic comedy. And those are my baby's feet next to it in this photo here. I have to say, getting this photo was not easy because, as I mentioned, the baby is 8 months old, which means that she is spending all her time flailing around and trying to crawl and do other things. So this is the only photo I managed to get that had the book in it and also had any part of her in it and wasn't a complete blur. Anyway, so this book, Love Curse, is set in the world of high school theater, and the main character, Melody McIntyre, is her school stage manager. And the theater crowd at her school is extremely superstitious, and so for every new show that they put on, they come up with a new rule that they have to follow, a new superstition that must be followed for that show, or else the show will be doomed. And for this year's Big Spring Musical, the rule they come up with is that Melody is not allowed to fall in love, because she's still getting over a very dramatic breakup that happened during the last show. So she thinks that this will be a very easy rule to follow, and she's eager to go along with it and support the show and keep it from being doomed. But then the next thing she knows, she is starting to fall for the beautiful girl who is playing Fantine in their spring production of Les Mis. So I'll say this book was very fun to write. My hope is that it wound up being obviously I didn't write it with 2020 in mind because I wrote it 2 years ago, but my hope is that it is light and fun and the kind of read that people are looking for now. And next I will talk about Music from Another World, which is my most recent book that's already out on shelves. It came out just this past March. And those are my older daughter's hands holding it up, by the way. And I see that she seems to have a Band-Aid on her finger. I guess she must have had a boo-boo when we took this photo, but she's recovered from it now. So this book is historical fiction set in the late 1970s, And for anyone surprised by that combination, the late 1970s is very much considered historical fiction by young adult standards. In fact, anything that takes place before the year 2000 is considered historical fiction by teenage standards because it happened before they were born. So this book is set in San Francisco and Orange County, California. You can see there's the Golden Gate Bridge on the cover. And it is set in the late 70s at the dawn of the modern gay rights movement. It is the era of Harvey Milk and Anita Bryant. And the book is about two girls who are assigned to be pen pals by their schools who get caught up in the movement. And it's also about punk music. I listened to a lot of Patti Smith while I was writing this book. Next, I'll show Our Own Private Universe. Here is a picture again of my older daughter helping me unpack the books that I received for this one. And then I put up an image of the cover here so that you could see it better. So this book came out in early 2017. And at that time, it was still pretty uncommon. It's less so now, but at that time, it was not common to see a cover like this, especially for a young adult book that made it very clear that the characters in the book were queer. Like this looks like two girls who are just about to kiss. And now it's a little more common to see covers like this. But when I first received this cover, I was very surprised and absolutely delighted to get a book that was this like clear about the fact that it was about queer characters. So this was my attempt at writing the book that I wish I'd had when I was a teenager myself. Because when I was growing up, I never got to see characters who were like me. I never got to see queer characters in books or shows or movies for the most part, really anywhere. And what I really wish I'd had then, and what I still wish that I had had as a teenager, was like a Judy Blume book about what it was like to be queer, about like the experience of being a queer teenager. So that's what I tried to write here. This is a romance between two girls, and the main character, Aki, that's her on the left in the cover image, she is bisexual, and this romance that she's having now is her first time really thinking about what it's like to actually have a relationship with a girl. And the story is, they're on a church youth group mission trip to Mexico, and assorted complications ensue with their relationship, including the fact that Aki's father is the minister who's supervising the group on the trip, and he does not know that she is bisexual. And if I can get it to pull up. Oh, skipped a slide. So since Halloween is coming up in a week, the last book of mine that I'm going to talk about is my scary book, which is As I Descended. Here is a photo of my wife holding the book and pretending to be very, very scared. So this is a retelling of Macbeth with ghosts instead of witches, and it's set in a modern boarding school in Virginia. It's a little bit Southern Gothic, a little bit Shakespeare, a little bit murdery, and it's queer. I changed the genders of a few of the characters in the play. So the main character of this is a 17-year-old girl named Maria, who is secretly in a relationship with her roommate Lily. And between the two of them, they come up with a sinister plot that leads to a few dead bodies, plus some vengeful ghosts whose spirits they manage to awaken. This one was also very fun to write. So, as is clear from the books that we've been talking through, the books that I write are about queer characters, and they are for teenagers. And all of the characters in my books are on the LGBTQ spectrum. All the main characters are, and in some cases, almost all the side characters are as well. And one question that I and every other author who writes about this population gets a lot is, do you get pushback on this? Are there concerned parties, either in the publishing industry or the reading public, who say this isn't appropriate material for kids, and does that affect the way my books are received? And the answer to that last question, as far as I can tell, about whether this affects the way my books are received, is not really. Those concerned parties are certainly out there, and more on them in the next slide. But in any way that is known to me, it doesn't directly affect my day-to-day work, which isn't to say that there aren't things happening that I don't know about. There could certainly be things happening behind the scenes. Like, for example, there could be a school that's considering inviting me to speak to their students, but then decides not to because parents might push back. That could definitely be happening, but because in that case, I wouldn't have received the invite in the first place, I wouldn't even know. But that's an aside. But that all brings me to this graph. So if you look at this graph, this is published young adult books with LGBTQ characters over the past decade and a half or so. And the data here is compiled by Melinda Lowe, who is an amazing author, and you should check out her website to see more of her data that she's collected, as well as check out her books, which are amazing. But you can see here the way the number of books published for teenagers featuring LGBTQ characters has really skyrocketed, especially over the past few years. After being stagnant, at the earlier part of the century. So I put in blue here a marker that shows where I entered the scene because my first book came out in 2014. And you can see that the numbers have climbed dramatically since then. And if you added 2019 and 2020 to this bar, it would be even more dramatic. 20 years ago, there may not have been a ton of appetite among publishers to put out books for kids about LGBTQ characters for whatever reason, probably because they thought they wouldn't sell. But that is no longer the case now. There's clearly a market for these books. And as I mentioned, the numbers would be even higher for this year. One recent week, I remember reading on Twitter that one week there were 7 books that came out just that week that were about LGBTQ characters that were young adult books. So just in 1 week, like there is a sea change from when I was a teenager for sure. And even a sea change from 2004 when there were only 9 books that came out in the entire year. So clearly very dramatic changes. But that being said, to go back to what I was saying earlier, although I personally haven't experienced pushback to my books for the fact that the characters are queer, that is not representative for all LGBTQ authors writing books for young people, not by any means. Even in this day and age, plenty of communities have faced extensive challenges. And to illustrate that, I put here the list of the most challenged books according to the American Library Association for last year. These are books that have been challenged by parents, by library patrons, by school administrators, or anyone else that they've asked to have removed from library collections, or moved from kids sections to the adult section, or moved to behind a counter where the kids would have to ask to check it out, or where they might need parental permission, or anything like that. And as you can see, last year of the 10 most challenged books, 8 of them were challenged at least partly because they had what the list calls LGBTQIA+ content. By the way, in light of recent events regarding an author whose name we will not mention, there's an irony in the fact that one of the 2 books that wasn't challenged for that particular reason is Harry Potter. But anyway, so the list has looked approximately like this for many years now. It's been remarkably consistent even before the current presidential administration. And even though more and more books that recognize LGBTQ lives have been published in recent years, there are still plenty of people out there who are clearly trying to suppress these stories and keep them out of readers' hands, especially if those readers are kids. But going back to cheerier topics, another question that I get asked about a lot is what it's like to be a writer, what a typical day is like. So I have some photos to share, mostly highlights from my Instagram. And I should clarify that what I'm going to show are images of what it's like to be a writer before the pandemic, because if I took photos now, they'd mostly be photos of me not writing while I chase the kids around the house or supervise virtual preschool. So I really enjoy, or at least I used to really enjoy, writing in public places. So on my writing days, I'd go out, find some place to set up camp that had a power outlet and a table, and I'd be all set. So here is a photo of me writing in my public library here in DC. On this particular day, I believe I was the first one to arrive in this part of the library, which is always lovely. The library has fewer distractions than most places, but when I'd be there, I'd often find myself staring at books and thinking things like, how much do I really know about the Romanov family? Like maybe I should take that biography down off the shelf and read that for a while. And that's when I would know that I was officially procrastinating and I needed to get back to work. I also really used to enjoy writing in coffee shops, but it's harder to take photos in those because they tend to be pretty crowded and taking photos of strangers is generally frowned upon. In fact, I remember one time I used to live in a neighborhood that had this very small coffee shop that I loved, and I would go there and write on Saturdays a lot. And this coffee shop was tiny. It had maybe 5 tables and they were all like 2-seater tables. So it was very small. And a lot of people would go there and stay there for hours working on different things the same way I did. And so because it was so small, often you would wind up sharing a table with a stranger. Like you just walk up to somebody if there were no tables that were empty and say like, hey, do you mind if I sit across you? They'd say sure. And then you would just each sit up with your laptops and not talk to each other for the rest of the time. And I remember one afternoon I was sitting there working and I was across from a guy who I didn't know. And I had walked past his screen enough to know that he was working on some kind of math assignment. He had like graphs and formulas and numbers, I don't know. And I was working on what was probably my first book at the time. And so I was writing a scene where it was a conversation between 2 characters. And I needed for my point of view character to describe the expression on the face of the girl she was talking to. And the girl she was talking to was like angry or something. I don't remember exactly. But I remember I was like, okay, well, what is her face going to look like while she's angry? And I was like, okay, well, what do I look like when I'm angry? And so I took out a mirror out of my purse and I sort of made a face into the mirror like, trying to like study what my face looked like in the mirror so that I could write about it. In the meantime, while I'm doing this, the guy across from me who's working on a math problem, I guess he must have come up with some kind of really good solution or solved a really hard problem or something, because all of a sudden out of nowhere, he just claps and pumps his fists in the air and yells, "Yeah!" And he's got headphones on, so he doesn't even know that he's even in a place with other people. But meanwhile, every head in this coffee shop is swerving toward our table while he is, pumping his fists in the air and cheering and yelling, and I'm like making this angry face into my mirror and trying to figure out what I look like. Anyway, so there are risks to be said for writing in public. Like, you never know what's going to happen. But if you're me, it's worth it. But anyway, going back to the library. Of course, libraries are also an excellent place to do actual research. And I often wind up checking out a lot of books to do research too. So for me and for most writers that I know, research is a big part of the writing process, especially early on when I'm just getting started and formulating my plot and figuring out the world where it takes place. So these are some of the books that I used for research when I was writing the historical novel I mentioned earlier, Music from Another World, which is set in the 1970s. And another very big part of the process, especially for me, is outlining. Now, I should say not all writers feel this way. There are a lot of writers who hate outlines and don't want to touch them. But for me, it's really important to get my thoughts organized before I sit down to start writing a draft. So usually what I actually use is Excel. Like, I really like spreadsheets for a lot of things, including outlines, but sometimes I need something a little bit more like tactile and visual. So here's one example of a book that I was working on. I think this is a book that I wrote called Pulp, which is also historical and has two different points of view. It has two different narrators. So what I did for this was I took each of the major scenes that I had and I wrote them on color-coded Post-its according to which character's point of view the scene is from. And then I took another color of Post-its and I wrote the chapter numbers on, and then I laid everything out on the floor and I could see, how my scenes related to each other. And I could say like, okay, well, I need to move this scene over here and this chapter needs to happen before that one because it connects thematically to this other one, and chronologically this has to happen first. And so it's a good way for me to figure out all of those sorts of things. But sometimes it goes a little far. Here's another example of me working with Post-its and office supplies to do an outline. This is when I was outlining my book that's coming out in December, The Love Curse of Melody McIntyre. And yes, there are 3 different trifold boards in this picture, and they are all for one book. I don't even remember what is happening with the color coding here, what exactly I was trying to do, because this book only has one point of view. It's only got one narrator. But it has, even though it's a light romantic comedy, it has a lot of stuff that happens in it. And the order in which everything happens is very important. It needs to build up in a particular way. So I spent an entire week with these different Post-it notes, moving them from board to board and moving the order from different order to different order. And that was quite an experience. And by the time I got to the end, I felt so proud of myself. I felt so accomplished. I had finally gotten all of my Post-its into the correct order on the correct boards, and I knew what was going to happen when, and I had a through line for the book, and I felt really good about it. And then I realized, I can't turn this into my editor. All I've got are trifold boards with Post-its on it. Like, I still have to do the work of sitting down and writing the scenes and connecting the scenes and writing what happens. Like, I can't publish my trifold boards. So that's a little frustrating. This is why part of the reason some writers don't like outlines. But another part of the process and another part of why writing is got a lot of steps to it is you look at how many drafts go into a finished book. I took a screenshot here of just some of the drafts for, again, this book, The Love Curse of Melody McIntyre. For me, my first drafts tend to be pretty bad. The words tend to be pretty bad. And the only thing that gets me through is knowing, like, I'm going to revise this a lot. I'm going to write a lot of drafts of this book. It's going to get better. And that is always very, very reassuring. But it also takes a lot of time. As you can see here, this is showing 11 drafts. Actually, it seems to, for whatever reason, draft 2 is not in this picture. I don't know if draft 2 got eaten by my computer or something. I definitely wrote draft 2. But this is showing up to draft 11, and I think I got up to at least draft 16 before I actually had this book finished and sent it off to my editor. So there's a lot of polishing, a lot of revision, a lot of re-outlining that happens in the process. And I mentioned that I like spreadsheets. Here is one example of another thing I use spreadsheets for. Besides outlining, I also use them for tracking my word count. It's really just a way of tracking how much I've done every day so that I feel accomplished. But so here you can see that I don't even know what book this screenshot is from, because this is back in 2017, but on March 31st of 2017, I had a book that started out as 85,000 words at the beginning of the day, and during that day I deleted 9,000 words. And that's the equivalent of cutting 2 or 3 chapters. And I didn't just go through and cut like entire chapters, though. I cut chunks from many different chapters of the book that added up to 9,000 words that I deleted. And then over the next 11 days, up until April 11th, I revised chapter by chapter, and all of those revisions involved putting words back in, like new words to replace the ones that I deleted, new words that were nowhere related to the words that I deleted. And by the end of just that 12-day process, my whole book was up to 91,000 words. So it was already 6,000 words more than where I had started, despite the fact that I deleted 9,000 words. So there's so much tinkering, so much like intricate level, you know, page by page work that goes into this kind of process. As a side note, my books tend to be pretty long, so that's why I wind up with numbers like this. Some people would never have a book that was 91,000 words long. Also in that same spreadsheet, I have a notes field that exists for no other reason except to give me a place to vent and write little things to myself. Again, I'm not sure what book this is for. This is just a screenshot that I took of one part of my notes field. And clearly there are some typos here because some of these don't even make sense. Like I wrote started draft 2 of book 2. I don't know what that means. I've never written a book 2. I've never written a sequel. I don't know what I meant to say there. But here's just some examples of the various notes that I've made to myself. It's entertaining to look back on, even if I'm not sure what exactly it entails. But so this is basically what writing looks like day in and day out. You can see this picture here. This is me at my kitchen counter with my computer and my outline printed out. And usually there's a baby monitor involved, as there is here. In the background, there's a dirty dish that I need to wash because everything tends to fall by the wayside when I'm trying to get work done. And it's just very much the kind of job where you have to be self-driven. I have deadlines, but it's up to me to set my own schedule and make sure I meet those deadlines. And it's up to me to sit down every day and force myself to commit for my goals for whatever I need to accomplish. Most of the time, what that looks like is sitting down and putting words on a screen or revising words that are already on a screen. So that brings me to the end of this set of slides. I'm going to put up this one that has images of some of my book covers, as well as some of the places where you can find me online. And at that point, I am ready to go ahead and transition to the Q&A. I'm not sure if I need to press any buttons to do that. If anybody could tell me if I do need to. Well, let's see. I will give it I will see if I can press anything that changes anything. I probably need to stop sharing my screen, right? Let's see. Ah, hi, Jessica.
Hi, Robin. Hello, everyone. I am Jessica Pride. I am a member of the LGBTQ+ Services Committee, and I'm kind of in the background doing things. But this is the time when, if you have questions, you can start typing them into the question box, and we will read them out for Robin to answer. But we've also got a few questions that we gathered ahead of time. So I'm going to ask you those. You've seen them all before, I promise. And then we can start gathering those questions if anyone in the audience has any. So I figured we'd start with an easy one. Well, it might not be easy, I don't know. What's been your favorite book to write so far?
That's a relatively easy question because some books are fun to write and some books are really, really difficult to write. But it's hard to pick just one favorite. Right now, I really have fond memories of writing Love, Curse of Melody McIntyre because it is the most recent one that I wrote, and it was a lot of fun. It's a book about musical theater, and I was never actually involved in musical theater, either in my youth or as an adult. But my wife was. She was highly involved, and so I spent a lot of time like quizzing her on like, okay, so what are some like things that a stage manager does, and what are some things that can go wrong, and what would a stage manager do if this went wrong, and what you know, and that was fun. I also got to go and as part of my research for that one, I went and watched the productions at a lot of the high schools in my area. I went and watched a lot of high school musicals, which was really, really fun. I got to go around to different schools I'd never been to before and watch really, really talented kids sing and dance and work in the tech booth and do all sorts of cool things. I got to see Legally Blonde at my neighborhood high school, and I got to go and watch shows that I'd never even heard of at other schools. Some of them, the kids were all fantastic in every iteration, although some schools clearly have much larger budgets than other schools. So you get to really see that kind of thing. But some of the shows themselves were better than others too. Like some of the shows that I saw were of questionable quality, but you know, the kids still gave it their all and it was really, really fun. So that's probably the one that I remember most fondly right now. Although I also really enjoyed writing As I Descended, the Macbeth retelling with ghosts in it that I mentioned, because that one is spooky and scary, and I am someone who gets scared very easily, but also hates being scared. Like, I don't like to watch horror movies; they freak me out way too much. But so it's easy and fun for me to think of things that scare me and try to figure out ways for those to scare readers of a book. And I remember one night I was working on that book, and it was very late and no one else in the house was awake, and I was writing a scene that was spooky, involved somebody like sneaking around a dark corridor or something. And in the middle of writing that scene, like my cat walked into the room and I jumped like 20 feet into the air. I had like scared myself so much, and the cat just, it was a black cat, alarmed me to like a very disturbing degree. But it's fun for me to do that kind of thing. So one of those two.
Those are both great stories about how you go through the process of even like developing things. I too am a scaredy cat who isn't very happy with being scared, but I do enjoy spooky things. So it's a very strange experience to not enjoy horror but like being spooked out.
Yeah, I have to be very, very picky. I read a lot of horror summaries on Wikipedia. If there's a movie that I really want to know what happens in that plot, I will not watch it. I will read the summary on Wikipedia, and then I will have a lot of feelings about it afterward.
Very nice. I should do that more.
It's also a good way to
So,
procrastinate.
oh yeah, perfect. So, and you have a couple books that are either set in multiple time periods or in historic time periods. But what other period of history would you really love to set a book?
So yeah, it's an interesting question because so I've got a couple of historical books out. I've got two books that are set in the 1950s and one that's set in the 1970s. So most of my historical settings don't really go back all that far, like they're still 20th century. One thing that I did for a short story once that I would love to revisit is, oh, I should give the context. I was part of an anthology called All Out, which is edited by Sandra Mitchell, and it's a collection of queer young adult authors writing books about queer teenage characters throughout history, going back to, I think the oldest story in it is set in like the 1400s. With the idea of this collection was to show that, we've always been here, like, queer people are not like a modern invention the way that, we're sometimes portrayed, like our stories have always been there, they just weren't being told. And so for that collection, I wrote a story that was set in 1726 in Kensington Palace in London. And it was a romance. It was a very light romance, almost kind of read like a Regency romance, although it's not the Regency period. But it was about a romance between two servant girls who worked at the palace, who were servants to one of the princesses who lived there at the time. And that was really fun. I really enjoyed doing research and learning more about that period in time. So I did that for a short story, and I'd love to, revisit something like that for a novel sometime as well. That'd be a big undertaking, but I think it'd be a lot of fun to like really go in depth exploring what it was like to be queer in a time like that.
That does sound like a lot of fun. I've read All Out, so I should remember exactly that story, but I'll have to
Well,
go
you should
back and
quiz on
read it
every story in that collection. You should tell us your opinions on them all.
now. But yeah, I should go back and read that because
There's a
that
lot
was
of good
fun to
stories
read.
in that. There's a lot of
Yes.
really fun stories.
So let's see. Oh, this is one that I'm curious about because I really like romantic stories and love stories. But your stories, while they often center young love, you don't force like a capital H, capital E happy ending if the story doesn't really allow for it. So what do you think it means, especially for young readers, to be able to see that kind of ending and to know that high school doesn't have to be a rom-com, or, they don't have to find their biggest, greatest love before they graduate?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that actually when I was a teenager, I did feel like I was supposed to find my great love before I graduated. And at this time I was like closeted. So it was very, very complicated. And I think there is still a feeling among, a lot of, sectors of society that like, especially if you're reading a lot of romances, and I love romances, by the way, I've written romances. My next book is a romance. Romances are great. But sometimes it can feel like that's how life is supposed to turn out. And if your life doesn't read like a romance novel, like something is wrong. And for most people, life doesn't really read like a romance novel. Even, I talk to kids who, are in high school and are dating or in relationships, and like there are ups and downs in even like the best case scenarios. Like it's never gonna, be be something you'd see in a movie. And I think it's important for kids to know that and to be thinking about that, kids and teenagers. And so I'd like to show different ways that things can work out. In my stories, I don't usually sit down with the intention of like, okay, I'm going to represent like this aspect of how a relationship could be. It's not really how I go into thinking about it, but I listen to the characters and what's going on with them. And I think like, okay, well, this character is, I don't see, you know, a happily ever after conclusion happening for this character as part of this story. And that's okay. I'm going to go with what seems authentic and true to the situation and try to write it the way that I think is an actual like realistic outcome. And I think it's nice to, it used to be that there were so few stories out there for teenagers about LGBTQ characters that it was almost as though, you know, you had to write it in a particular way. Some people felt like they had to write them in a particular way in order to, you know, show a positive outcome or whatever. But now there's enough to choose from that readers can really go with, you know, I'm feeling like a rom-com, I'm feeling like, you know, a romance that I know is going to have a happy ending versus like, you know, I want to read something that might have kind of a different feel. And now you have enough choices that that's, you know, it's really something that's out there. So I try to encompass that in my writing as well.
Yeah, it's really something to have those choices. I was on the Rainbow Book List committee a few years ago,
Yay.
and even talking to the people who had been on that committee for a few years or had been on it years ago and come back to see the great number of change in just options for books for young readers that have queer content was just an amazement to them. It's just like your graph showed, it's jumped so high, and it's really great to see. So it is nice that we can sort of add some nuance to the experience instead of feeling like we have to make sure that that one experience is shown enough.
Yeah. No, I was about to go into talking about how it's great that we've got so much more diversity across the board too, in terms of genre, in terms of representation. But I know you've got more questions on that coming up, so I don't want to jump the gun.
I mean, if you want to talk about that, go for it.
Okay, my daughter's making a quick cameo. She's gonna grab something for her craft that she needs. Okay. So did you want to go on to the next one?
I can.
Oh, sure. Oh, sorry, did you ask? I'm sorry, did I?
Sorry. If you wanted to talk more about the importance of diversity, like I won't
Sure.
stop you.
Oh, sure. No, sorry, I was distracted. So in the middle of that, my 4-year-old came in. I don't know what happened to her pants, but she didn't have her pants and she went to get some crafts. Anyways, so yes, and when you were talking about like the difference, you talked about the Rainbow Book List and like what the committee has seen change over the past few years, and it's been fascinating to see the change in both genre as well as representation. But for genre specifically, it used to be like back in like the early days, like 2004, 2005, like when we first started seeing like a significant number of LGBTQ YA books first started getting public attention, they were pretty much all realistic fiction. They were all, and a fair number of them were like what's called coming out stories, which kind of gets a bad rep. I mean, I think that we have always needed coming out stories and we'll always need coming out stories. But now we're seeing both, we're seeing a much greater variety in terms of like now we're seeing a lot more fantasy, we're seeing a lot more sci-fi, we're seeing a lot more otherworldly stuff that includes queer characters and trans characters, which is awesome and exciting. And we're also seeing realistic fiction that is about characters who are already out or for whom coming out is not like their central issue or their central journey of the story. And that's exciting to see. And then we're also seeing a lot more diversity in terms of representation, racial representation, gender representation, socioeconomic representation, geographic representation, religion. We're seeing so much more diversity across the board now than we were seeing even just like, 3-4 years ago. And that's also really exciting. And I think that's, partially due to just the boom in total number of LGBT representative books that are being published, but it's also because of the We Need Diverse Books movement and other associated pushes that are finally getting enough attention for more representation in kids' books across the board. So that's been really fantastic and exciting to see.
And that is the perfect segue into the last question I will ask, which is, why is it so important, especially right now, to have happy, diverse, queer books, especially for young readers?
So what struck me about your question, the way that you phrased it, you said, especially right now. I'm like, you can look at it especially right now in terms of like the overall place where we are as a culture, but you can also look at it especially right now in terms of like late 2020 when the whole world is falling apart around us. And in both cases, yes, we need happy, diverse representation, which isn't to say there isn't a place for sad books. Like there's lots of fantastic sad books out there, including books about LGBTQ readers. And it's important to note that obviously not everyone's experience, not all queer and trans teenagers are having like happy experiences, and we want to represent the entirety of what that experience is like. But it is wonderful to be able to escape into a story and have it be fun and have it be entertaining. Whether fun for you means, you know, a book about dragons and adventure, whether fun for you means a book about kids in high school like enjoying their time with each other, and to have those characters feel like people that you know, feel like yourself, to be able to see mirrors of your own life represented in the kinds of stories that make you happy to read. Like that's something that's extremely important right now when the world is falling apart, and even when, you know, in 2021 when life is hopefully better, it will still be important to be able to escape in that way from whatever is happening in life and in the world.
That is so very true. I'm a particularly escapist reader, but there is a time when I do need a sad book. So thank you for reminding me that it's good to have those sad stories. And Caitlin, you see Caitlin here. She is going to be reading from the audience's Q&A. And those of you in the audience, you still have time. If you're still thinking about asking that question, you can just pop it into the question box and Caitlin will be able to read it for you and Robin will be able to answer it for you.
All right, Robin, I have a few questions for you from the audience. Megan, I feel like this question might be a good segue from what you just talked about. Do you think your books also help adults who have children or young adults identifying as LGBTQIA+ on the QIA+ spectrum?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks for asking. I have definitely gotten emails from parents who are, you know, thinking about things like this, and which is very interesting to see because, you know, when I was a teenager, this is not a conversation that would have been happening. Yeah, I think that, you know, what I try to do in my books is to touch on the feelings of teenagers and all their complexity about whatever they might be dealing with. And as a parent myself, obviously my kids are younger, but trying to tap into the mindset of what a child is thinking can be a very, very tricky thing. And it's important to remember, you know, just how complex kids' brains are and teenagers' brains are. And so I think that's definitely something that I try to touch on. It's not something that I will say that's not an intent that I have when I sit down to start writing. I'm not thinking about how the parents I'm really thinking about like teen readers. But I definitely have heard from parents who tell me that they have talked to their kids about my books, or that they've read my books and then their kids have read the books and they've talked about them together, and that it's been helpful to be able to have those conversations.
Thank you. No, I definitely think it is, and I think it's helpful to read books on that. So what other questions do we have? It looks like I have one from Ruth Ann, and she asked, I love historical fiction and I really enjoyed Pulp. What inspired you to intertwine a modern day POV and historical POV in Pulp?
Thank you. Well, since I didn't talk about Pulp during the presentation, I'll just give the really quick summary. So Pulp is a book that is half historical and half set in the present day. It intertwines the stories of a girl who's living in 2017 here in Washington, D.C., and she is an out and proud lesbian. And she one day stumbles upon an ebook of a like little known book, or little known to her book that came out in the 1950s. And she starts reading about it and realizes there was this whole genre of books that were out in the 50s called, which are now known as lesbian pulp fiction. These were lesbian romance novels that were sold for, you know, very cheaply. They were sold for like a dime or a quarter in drugstores or bus stations, and they were marketed primarily to men. The idea was that they were very lurid, although they really weren't. They had covers that were supposed to be very scandalous at the time, and so. On the inside, they were just very like, you know, romance novels, like the kind that anybody else would read for the most part. And so but they were about lesbians in the 1950s at a time when almost every queer person was closeted by necessity, because to be uncloseted was to risk like losing your job and potentially your house and your family and all sorts of things. So the main character of this book, Abby, finds this book and is shocked to discover that this was a whole subculture at the time. Some lesbians are writing these books and lesbians were buying them and reading them because this was the only representation they had of any kind of what their lives were like. And so she reads this book and she becomes obsessed with tracking down the author of this book, who is known to have disappeared. She wrote this one book that was very successful at the time, and then she just vanished off the face of the earth. And so Abby, the main character, decides she's going to try to figure out what happened to this author who disappeared. And at the same time, we get the story of that author who wrote this book when she was 18 years old. And it's about her, experience of being a closeted lesbian and finding these books exist herself, and decides that she's going to write a book like this. And so it's about her struggle to do that while staying safe and also exploring her first romance. And so, sorry, going back to your actual question, which was what inspired me to intertwine those two stories. And what inspired me was actually doing research for another book. I wrote another book that was set in the 50s, and doing my research for that, I came across these lesbian pulp fiction novels, and I thought, well, that sounds really cool. And that's sort of that the fact that those books were out there sort of lingered in my mind as like something that'd be interesting to explore. And then I think what happened was I was reading an article on a website called Autostraddle, which is a website for queer and non-binary people. It's awesome. And they had an article about lesbian pulp fiction. And I was thinking, like, I wonder how this would look to like a teenager today. Like these books, some of them have like very florid prose and are not what a teenager today would read. But I was thinking, like, what would it be like for a teenager to like interact with this genre and like learn more about it? And like, so that's how the idea occurred to me to like write two different stories that were connecting the two eras.
Thank you. I really liked Pulp because I feel like it also just appeals to intergenerational, like YA adults, everyone, because of that, because going back and forth and that historical context. So I'm really enjoying that. And, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one other thing about Pulp with the intergenerational, since you mentioned it. I get when I get emails about Pulp, I get emails about all my books, and it's always interesting to see what different people react to. When I get emails from adults who read Pulp, they always want to talk to me about the historical storyline and that character, and they're always really interested in her. When I get emails from teenagers, they always want to talk about the modern character and like about her, she's got this complicated relationship with her ex-girlfriend, and they want to talk about that because they've all got complicated relationships with their ex-girlfriends. They want to talk to me, and it's fascinating to hear. I'm like, wow, the world has changed so fast, and I can see it playing out in my inbox. It's really fun.
That's awesome to hear, and that's a perfect example. That's so cool. Let's see, one more question. I have a few more questions. Rachel asked, is it offensive for straight authors to write about LGBTQ characters?
Well, that is a big question that is talked about a lot, and I don't think there's a straightforward answer to it. There's a big discussion happening, and that has been happening for decades, but is especially intensified in the past couple of years, about, especially in children's books, about people writing within their own identity and writing outside their own identity. And it's very, very complicated. And it really, everything winds up depending on the individual situations. And part of what makes it complicated, especially when you talk about straight authors writing queer characters, for example, is like, who is it for any one of us to know the identity of the person behind a book? Like, I'm someone who, I'm a woman married to a woman. I'm very out about, I've been out about that for many, many years. And I'm, but there are some people who's are either not in a position to be out about their identity, maybe sometimes for safety reasons, sometimes because, their own identity is, fluid or shifting, or they're in the process of understanding themselves. So it's really tricky territory to get into, like, who's allowed to write books about queer characters. There isn't really a straightforward way to look at that. So there's a lot of nuance.
Thank you. That's definitely a tough question. And I think one we will continue to, talk about for many, many years to come. Let me see. It looks like I have one more question in the chat. It's from Megan, and it says, what is your favorite part of releasing a new book?
Ooh, that's interesting. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question before, Megan. Probably my favorite part is, it's hard because I can't really do it right now. One of my very favorite things to do was always to go to book festivals for teenagers and meet teenage readers who would come up and talk to me about my books and their feelings about them. That's something that sadly I didn't get to do for my last book, which came out in March, and I guess I'm not going to get to do that for this next book either, and for a while. But that's probably my favorite thing, is hearing from young readers about what they liked and what they didn't like, and how books made them feel and stuff like that. Like that's the most rewarding thing. I do still get emails and social media comments and stuff like that. So you know, I love those kinds of things when they come from teenagers, especially.
All right, it doesn't look like I have any more questions from the audience right now. We can give it a few minutes to see if anything comes up for anyone. Okay, let's see. I think Jessica said she sent me a couple more questions. If you are okay with that, Robin.
Of course.
All righty, let me go to my chat. Are there any other age groups you want to write for?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I've been my first book came out in 2014, and it's been interesting to see the kinds of responses I get from readers. It used to be that most of the responses I got from readers were from like either from adults or from older teens. I'm actually getting more and more notes from younger readers, including like down to like ages like 12, 11, 10 even sometimes, which is really fun. Even though my books are, for the most part, about older characters, like I think one of my books, Our in Private Universe, is about a 15-year-old, but most of them are about kids who are 17 or so. And so it's fun to think that kids are reading about older characters. But I would love to write something specifically for that age group at some point. Like I'd love to write a middle grade story, especially because more and more younger people are starting to think about their identity in this way, in terms of, you know, sexuality and gender identity, which is really exciting and fantastic to see. And so I'd love to write something someday that explores that for that age group.
That sounds really exciting, and we would love to have it here at the library.
Thank you.
All right, and one more question. Ooh, this is kind of fun. I always love recommendations or suggestions for more reads. Who are some up and coming authors you'd recommend readers check out if they're interested in more queer YA?
Sure. I've got several that I could recommend. I would start with, it's kind of like, how do we define up and coming? But these are folks who are newer on the scene, at least. And one is Leah Johnson, who wrote You Should See Me in a Crown, which just came out earlier this year. I think it came out around the spring. And it's a really, really cool, it's being branded as a romantic comedy. I wouldn't actually call it that. I'd call it more like coming of age. But it's about a girl who, in order to get a college scholarship, which she desperately needs, decides to run for prom queen in her school. And she is very much not a prom queen type, and her school is very obsessed with prom and like doing things in this very traditional way when it comes to things like prom court. And so she is running, and she's also queer, and winds up developing a romance with one of the competitors, one of the other girls who's also running for a prom court. So that's one I definitely recommend. It's, again, Leah Johnson, You Should See Me in a Crown. If you're into fantasy, it's good to check out Natasha Nung, who has a series. The first book in the series is called Girls of Paper and Fire. And that's set in this like lush Asian-inspired fantasy world. And it's about a girl with a very strict caste system. And it's about a girl who is of the lowest tier and is forced to like abandon her family and become a consort to the king. And she, with a group of other girls, and she and one of the other girls develop a relationship. So that's it's very harrowing and very fantasy. So if you're into adventure, that's a good one to check out. And then also his first book isn't out yet, but I mentioned Kosoko Jackson. Oh, sorry, I should repeat her name. Natasha Nung, and the book is Girls of Paper and Fire. And then the last one I'm going to recommend is Kosoko Jackson, who his book is coming out. I think it's coming out in February. It's called Yesterday is History, and it's really fun. It's well, realistic except for the part where there's time travel in it. It's got time travel and love triangle involving different time periods and organ donation. It's very cool and different and very romantic. And he's another author to watch. He's got quite a few books in the pipeline, I believe.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciated having you here today. Thank you all for joining us. Oh, Jessica is signaling me. Do we have one more question? We have one more question.
Okay.
Before we go, let's see. Thank you for whoever wrote in the last question. It's from Ruth Ann, and it says, do you have any books or plans to write one with characters on I think it's asexual or aromantic spectrums?
Yes, I have plans that I'm not allowed to talk about.
Not
Not as a main character, since that's not my experience, but in term, yes, that is all I will say.
we look forward to seeing what that's going to be.
Mhm.
Thank you. All right, let me check the questions one more time. I don't think I see any more questions. So again, just thank you so much. It really resonated when you talked about not having books with queer characters growing up. And it's just so important that queer youth get to see themselves. So thank you for writing and all your works and coming here today and hopefully inspiring readers and maybe even potential writers. So thank you again, Robin.
Thank you so
And
much. It's been really fun.
thank you.
Great questions, everybody.
Great questions. And thank you for everyone joining us. Remember, there's some links in the chat if you were interested in our Adult Book Club Rainbow Reads or our library swag. You can also follow us on Instagram. We're pimalibrary.lgbtq. And on behalf of Pima County Public Library's LGBTQ Plus Services Committee, just thank you for joining us for this 2020 virtual author talk with Robin Talley, all the way from Washington, D.C. And we look forward to seeing you next year at our next author talk. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.